Friday, September 4th, 2020. Miami, Florida, 10:41 p.m. 29-year-old Andrea Puerta is heading home after a long day's work as a dog walker.
I need to walk around 12 dogs to 30 dogs, depends on age. So I take the Metro Mover like I always do.
Usually, the train is a place where Andrea can unwind.
I always feel so safe here.
As the Metro Mover's surveillance cameras record, everything seems routine.
What you see in this video is Andrea is sitting by herself in the back of the car.
I was in my phone like I always do it. Everything was normal.
Then, a man comes into the car. Andrea doesn't pay any attention to him, but he's behaving suspiciously.
This person comes in, he goes out, and just in the second where the doors are gonna close, he comes in again.
At 6'2" and 210 pounds, the stranger towers over petite Andrea, who is barely 5'5", and she's completely blindsided by what he does next.
He just starts beating Andrea without a word.
He doesn't give her a chance to get up. He just slams her and beats her into the train.
I remember I say, stop, stop, and I start to cover my face.
He brutally beats her. Her body is flung across the train.
And most chilling, it's not clear what this man wants.
Is he carrying a knife? Is he carrying a gun? Is he going to do something even worse?
I was so confused because my head, he punched me so much. I don't remember to be tossed around.
As the train barrels down the track, all she does remember is thinking one thing.
If the train will not slow down, he will kill me.
Her life is flashing before her eyes.
But then the angry man says something that gives her a brief moment of hope.
He told me, I'm sorry, and I think that he's gonna stop. And I look at his eyes, and after that, I don't remember anything more.
Andrea is helpless as the man continues his attack.
His words are saying sorry, but his actions are not. There is an inner conflict. Is he hearing a voice telling him to do this? Is he having hallucinations? We don't know, but he is disturbed because who would beat someone like this?
After 57 excruciating seconds, the train finally slows down for its next stop. And Andrea knows this is her only chance to escape.
My head started to work. I realized the Metro Mover is gonna stop. So he was scared to meet another person. When the door opened, are the seconds that saved my life.
As Andrea stumbles off the train, the first thing she does is call her dad in Colombia.
I don't know how I walk, I don't know who helped me, and I call my dad. And when I start to talk to him, I start to understand where I was.
Andrea's dad begs her to call 911.
I called the police, and the woman told me, stay with me in the phone and find a police car.
She's terrified for herself and for other passengers.
I saw a guy coming on board. He saw me. I told him, don't go in. He's gonna punch you.
Dazed and injured, Andrea limps away from the train station with police still on the phone. But a few blocks away, she sees something that makes her freeze.
I see a police car 2 stations after the station that I live. He was there. He was arrested.
Suddenly, she comes face to face with this attacker, and now he's being arrested for beating up 2 more people.
Lucky for them that they were 2. And while he's attacking one of them, the other one gets to reach the alarm.
One man is punched in the head, the other pummeled to the floor.
Once the train stops, this guy just nonchalantly gets off the train and acts as if nothing happened.
That's when the police finds him.
I was so angry. And I say for the police, this guy punched me. I look at his eyes and I start to take pictures of him. The one that he always remember what he did to me.
The man is 25-year-old Joshua King. He's arrested on charges of aggravated battery.
She wants to show the police that this is the guy that attacked me brutally. He's not getting away.
A vicious and alarming attack on board a Miami Metro mover. The alleged attacker caught, but many are left on edge after what happened.
Because of what's called the Baker Act in Florida, which allows for mental health evaluation, King spends only 1 night in jail and is then sent for mental assessment.
These psychological evaluations will be crucial. Who knows, maybe he was hearing voices telling him to attack them.
But it makes Andrea angry.
He tried to kill me. My body is completely destroyed.
The attack leaves her with bruises across her face and arms, a concussion, broken rib, fractured jaw, and back injuries.
She was in a really, really dark place. She was physically wounded, she was mentally wounded, and she was emotionally destroyed. This was an attempt of murder. He was going to kill her, and the only thing that he didn't have was the time.
It takes more than 2 weeks before police release the video of the attack, and Andrea is able to watch what happened.
For 15 days, I didn't know how bad this was. When I saw what happened to me is when I understand that I need to say something, because this can't happen no more.
After the video was released, I watched it with her. It just got me sick to my stomach.
The video elicits outrage.
This is the video of that brutal beating on the Metro mover. The victim attacked for no apparent reason.
The video of what took place is disturbing.
Andrea posts the video on social media, and as her friends help circulate it, it quickly goes viral.
Once we put up the video, everyone started reaching out.
I didn't know how to handle the situation because I never been with lawyers or police.
I decided to start a GoFundMe page for Andrea because it was just unbearable for her.
Adela's page raises more than $16,000 for Andrea's medical needs, therapy, and legal help.
Adela, I think she was my angel.
As she awaits King's next court date, Andrea has taken up boxing. She's also pursuing action against Miami-Dade County and the train's security company for inadequate security.
The woman filing suit after being attacked on Miami's Metro mover.
I have my moments that I cry because I think that I lost the person that I was because I don't see the role like before.
Still, Andrea, who has a restraining order against King, is determined to make sure he knows he did not destroy her.
You punched the wrong woman because I'm not gonna accept that you do this for anybody. When I decide to make justice, and I understand how strong I am, you love yourself more, you know your capacity.
In Chicago, a couple violated in their own home is is also seeking justice. Monday, July 25th, 2016. Chicago's Bucktown neighborhood, 3 a.m.
That's like the witching hour. Most of America is sleeping at 3 o'clock.
The neighborhood is already on edge after a rash of recent robberies. But now, things are about to get even scarier. Jack McKercher is relaxing at home with his girlfriend.
July 25th was a normal summer night. I'd been hanging out on the balcony on the top floor and just kind of chilling. After that, came inside and just ended up kind of watching TV, falling asleep on the couch.
But what they don't know is that they're not alone. There's a strange man hovering above them.
Someone is standing in your stairway looking down on you in your own house.
It is so eerie. It's so creepy. Am I seeing what I believe I'm seeing up there? It's haunting.
And whoever he is, he just stands there, almost motionless.
He's almost stuck. In my experience with people like that, it's like they're on a mission and they have to get it done.
Is this intruder frozen in fear, or is he calculating his next move?
He's being very careful. He doesn't want to creak in the floor or make any sounds to alert his presence. He's clearly done this before.
As the TV show plays, everyone remains asleep, including Jack's two dogs, who are oblivious to the danger lurking above them. Does this man intend to rob the couple, or something worse?
We don't know what this guy is capable of.
About 14 minutes in, he's still barely moved. And that makes it disturbing. That is a long time to be hovering over someone. What will he do? This truly is what horror movies are made of.
When the show ends and the credits roll, the intruder slips back into the darkness. Seconds later, the unsuspecting couple wakes up. They have no idea what awaits them upstairs.
The homeowners are literally following this burglar into their bedroom.
What is he going to do?
All this can go bad real quick.
The next morning, Jack's girlfriend is in a panic. She can't find her purse. So Jack checks the footage on their home security cameras.
I figured, hey, maybe I look at the footage. Zach was joking, saying that she probably left it somewhere herself.
But what he sees is shocking.
When I first clicked to the video, I first kind of saw a shadow in the top corner. Everyone's like, what the hell is this? And then I noticed there was someone at the top of the stairs.
When they see the man who was watching them as they slept, they're horrified.
As soon as you see that, it's a shocking feeling, and then anger, but then I was like, how the hell did that happen?
Who is this man? And how did he get into their house?
This is a terrifying situation. We don't know what he wants.
Someone random in your house.
What is he doing?
Who knows if he has a weapon?
Jack watches the security footage over and over again, disturbed by how he and his girlfriend barely escaped harm.
He went extremely slow, almost like sloth slow. It looked like he tried to creep into my office, just to the right of where he was standing. He lingered at the top of the stairs for 15 to 30 minutes. It seemed like he almost watched the TV, the show that we were watching, until it ended. He got quiet. We woke up, and then he saw us waking up and creeped out. He was exiting the bedroom as we were entering the bedroom.
Jack realizes the intruder must have come in the same way he left, through an unlocked upstairs balcony.
He enters from the back bedroom and then leaves back to the bedroom. My fault leaving the third-story bedroom door unlocked.
The frightened couple immediately files a police report.
When I showed the video to police, they actually asked me if I could get it out of slow motion and fast forward it a bit, and it wasn't in slow motion. When the police watched the footage, they were freaked out themselves.
Frightening video of a creepy criminal.
The creepy video is soon all over the news and becomes the main topic of discussion on Jack's Neighborhood Watch group on Facebook.
I first saw the video posted by the victim in our group. He was reaching out as a call for help. Does anybody recognize this person? And when he posted that, it spread very quickly, and a lot of comments, a lot of concern.
It also catches the attention of a reporter who happens to live in the very same neighborhood.
This was brought up on a neighborhood watch page that I was part of. It did happen just a few blocks from my home. What if that were me? You see this in the movies, but not in a home that is around the corner.
One victim shared with us what he posted, an intruder watching him sleep.
I still have chills. Who would not be at least mildly disturbed by watching this?
When the media got involved, from that point, it actually blew up pretty big. They called him the Bucktown Creeper.
Nobody knows who the man is, but suspicion grows that the Bucktown Creeper has been canvassing their neighborhood for some time.
Our neighborhood watch group was blowing up. People were posting images of a man on a bike taken from people's security cameras on the outside of their garages and the alleys.
The same guy on the bike, I had actually been going door to door throughout the neighborhood, just seeing doors were unlocked. As soon as I saw the footage, I started to put two and two together. The hoodie was the same, everything was the same.
Jack is convinced it's the same man who was in his house.
I don't know how he noticed a third-story balcony on the back side of a home that's not facing any street being unlocked, but he finally found one.
On July 27th, 2 days after the stranger lurks on Jack's stairs,
10-4, I made contact on my other.
Police arrest a person of interest. He was riding a red bike, and his clothes match what the intruder was wearing on Jack's footage.
It looked just like the man on my stairs.
But he's released the same day. And as people fear the Bucktown Creeper is still on the loose, the neighborhood is on edge.
Residents stepped up their own patrols, walking together in the overnight hours.
He was testing door to door. A lot of neighbors were concerned that their door might be next.
Then, 3 weeks later on August 15th.
Now to an ABC 7, the Bucktown burglar striking again, another victim coming forward as new video surfaces.
A man is caught on camera outside a complex that was burglarized right after Jack's frightening encounter. But it turns out not to be the same guy.
That was a completely different person from who was in our video.
And then Jack learns that a few days before the second video hit the news, police made an arrest. The man had tried to use a stolen library card that was taken in an overnight burglary. Police suspect this man is the Bucktown Creeper, and it's the same person of interest they identified before.
They said they found him out, still kind of wearing the same hoodie, on the same bike as in some of the videos, but that was definitely the same guy, the same gentleman that was in my home. It was good to get him caught off the streets.
Nothing was revealed about what the man's intentions were when he went to Jack's house.
We'll probably never know what he was thinking or what he was doing.
But the creepy incident has left Jack rattled.
There is some PTSD that comes with having somebody in your home. You could wake up at night and be like, you know, someone looking at me. I certainly had those thoughts.
And Jack says the most important lesson is to never get too comfortable, even in your own home.
Got to be smart, lock the doors. You never know what's going to happen. Be wary of anything at all times. Just got to keep your head on a swivel. Just do the right thing.
New York City, 911. Do you need police, fire, or medical?
The police. This guy tried to grab a little child.
Oh my God. Did you just get somebody out here?
Monday, November 9th, 2020, New York City's Madison Square Park.
It's a lovely park. My girlfriend and I are meeting up with one of our friends, and we're sitting on the park bench talking to our friend, and I hear commotion. I hear yelling, I hear screaming, and I want to check it out, make sure everything's okay.
Brian walks away to see what's going on.
I'm thinking that he'll be gone for a couple minutes and then he'll return.
But neither Brian or Mandy have any idea that he's about to walk into a dangerous situation.
I walk up, and there's a man, and he's playing tug-of-war with a mom with a baby in a stroller.
Behind the crowd of bystanders, a frightening altercation is taking place.
And she's pleading, let go, please let go.
This man tried to grab this lady's stroller.
Is the baby in the stroller?
She is pleading for him to let go of the stroller, and he is saying things like, how do you know this is your baby?
I want to identify the kid. I want to identify.
He's very aggressive.
I want to know that's my kid. Get away. I want to know that's my kid.
This is a parent's worst nightmare. She's trying to wrestle away her own baby from this maniac.
People quickly surround the mother, trying to help her pry the stranger's hands off her baby's stroller.
So as this crowd is forming around them, they're screaming at him, he's screaming at them, and this woman is terrified.
But he won't let go of the stroller. He says, let go of the stroller. Let go of the stroller, I'm gonna knock you out.
We're talking about an attempted kidnapping here. We don't know if this person's armed. We don't know what they're capable of.
I hear people saying, call the police, call the police.
That's when Brian, a trained martial arts coach, decides he has to do something.
But for that moment, I'm just observing. I don't want to escalate the situation. But at that point, I feel that it was only a matter of seconds till it was gonna come to blows. So I walk around the man, I put my hands around him and use a jiu-jitsu move to bring him to the ground. I transition to what's called a seatbelt grip. You're behind them. Essentially, they're wearing you like a backpack. Your legs are around them, your arms are around them, and you can really limit what they are able to do. I want to keep him restrained, keep myself safe, keep the crowd safe, and also him away from the mom and the baby. It really allows me to be able to control someone without hurting them. I'm just holding him until police show up or someone shows up to take care of the situation.
He doesn't have to do this, but he jumps in to try to help this young lady and the baby out of nowhere. Is the Good Samaritan of the day.
No, I'm not, man. You trying to take a kid? You trying to take a kid?
But now that he's pinned to the ground, the man only becomes more angry.
Stop it, liar. Liar.
As others try to help Brian, even sitting on the man's feet, the crowd grows larger.
There's an angry mob forming. People are walking by asking, what's going on? And bystanders will tell them, this man just tried to take a baby from a mother.
The crowd is angry. They are calling him all kinds of names. And this is becoming an even more dangerous situation because now we don't know if the crowd wants to exact some sort of street justice against the perpetrator.
An attempted kidnapping in Manhattan tried to take a stroller with a baby inside.
As the man who tried to steal a woman's baby angrily thrashes his arms, the crowd loses control.
People will get mad, and the more the crowd is antagonizing him, the more he's fighting back.
Get the You're lying.
He's just lashing out. He's screaming, he's shouting obscenities, trying to wrestle away, he's trying to headbutt him, and it's taking a while for the police to arrive.
One of the guys is about to get hurt if somebody doesn't show up really fast. This is the crazy guy. He's going to hurt everybody. He's going to probably kill somebody. So we need help.
In the midst of the commotion, Brian never loosens his grip on the man, but he starts to worry.
It's only a matter of time till my grip gives out. Even though these moves, these physical moves are effective, you can't do something forever. It's only a matter of time till your muscle gives out. There are times where I actually look up and ask people in the crowd if they could call the police, and they tell me that they already did.
We're waiting for the police. We've been waiting for 10 minutes.
They're waiting for the police for so long, and the police are not here.
And the first thing that starts going numb was my left leg. So that's only a matter of time till I have to let go.
Brian can't see where the mother and her child have gone, but his reasons for wanting to protect them are personal.
I was involved in an incident where I got jumped in 2010. And when I got out of the hospital, I kind of just immersed myself in martial arts. And initially it was to protect myself. But later on, you learn that you can help others as well.
This is not out of character for him. There have been instances where we've been traveling together or we've seen a bar fight where he will step up to help somebody in need.
But this time, it seems Brian may not be able to save the day.
He's holding down this perpetrator for over 15 minutes, which is an eternity when you're trying to hold someone down who doesn't want to be held down.
Finally, after 17 minutes, park rangers show up to help subdue the man. And 30 minutes after the frightening attack first begins, police arrive and put the agitated attacker in an ambulance.
I don't know why he wanted to take the baby, but it was definitely very clear that he was not all the way there. Someone like this needs treatment, needs help.
With the situation now under police control, Brian walks away.
As I leave, the crowd starts clapping. And that was the moment when I felt like I did something good.
As Brian comes up to me, he's trembling, he's shaking.
And first thing my girlfriend says to me is, "Where were you? Where you been?" I'm actually limping because my right leg got hyperextended because of the weight that was on it.
We find out that he has subdued a potential kidnapping. I definitely thought about all the ways this could have gone wrong. The mob mentality, if someone had a weapon, who knows who could have gotten hurt.
What Brian didn't know is that after he stepped in to help, the terrified mother made a break for it with her baby and dialed 911.
Just like grabbed onto my stroller and said, "This is my son, why are you taking him?" And he got really violent. I think he's hallucinating.
Are you injured?
No, I'm just scared.
People start referring to this young man as a hero, and he truly is the definition of a hero. He put his own safety at risk for someone he didn't even know.
A Good Samaritan is speaking out tonight about how he used jiu-jitsu to take down a man who's accused of trying to steal a baby.
A New Yorker is being praised for using his training in martial arts to stop an alleged attempted kidnapping.
The press requests were coming from all over the world, from China to Mexico to the UK. It seemed just about everywhere.
33-year-old Kemsley was in Madison Square Park when he heard screaming.
Telling everyone it was his baby. I got him to the ground.
Where's your cape and your Superman shirt?
I think it's funny to hear things joking that Brian's a superhero, but he really is very brave.
Brian is modest about what he did and says he doesn't feel like a hero.
The bar for being a hero should not be set this low. When you hear a woman screaming and see a man trying to take a baby away from a woman, everyone should jump in.
And of all the attention he got after the video of the incident went viral, it was one letter that touched him most.
So 2 months later, the mother wrote me an email. I needed some time to digest the shock. I do pass the park multiple times every single day, so there isn't a day where I don't thank you. It was very brave and kind of you to help a random stranger, and it really warmed my heart and reinforced my faith that people are genuinely good.
The man who tried to take the woman's child was never publicly identified. After a mental health evaluation, he was deemed unable to care for himself, and no charges were filed.
Wherever he is, I just hope he gets the treatment he needs. My takeaway from this situation is that when something like this happens, you don't have to react violently. It is still possible to get through it all with the mother, the child, the crowd, the suspect, and myself, all unharmed.
In South Africa, another man faces the same situation as Brian when a child is snatched right out of her chair. September 10th, 2020. Johannesburg, South Africa. It's a beautiful day, and Dishal Suku is sitting with his father on the patio of his new pizzeria, De La Casa.
De La Casa means in my home. It's a very family-oriented restaurant, giving customers that warm family experience. It was around 4:35 p.m. in the afternoon. The restaurant was fairly busy.
As security cameras show, the crowd includes a mother and her 2 daughters.
They just came out for the evening to have a pizza and some milkshakes.
With his customers busy eating, Dishal sits back down with his dad, but then notices something suspicious.
We just saw a guy outside. He was making a bit of noise. He turned towards the restaurant and he just started running. I jumped up immediately. What is this guy trying to do?
You see this man running up to the restaurant. It looks like he's trying to rob the place.
My initial thought was, he's going for a cell phone or a handbag, something you could just grab and run away. But as he jumped over, he ran straight for this child.
It is terrifying. In broad daylight, a stranger is trying to take this mother's child. Horrified, she leaps over the table in a desperate attempt to save her.
This is a mother's worst nightmare. To see her child in sheer terror, to see a stranger literally ripping her child away from her in the middle of a restaurant, in the middle of the day.
It's a mother's instinct to jump and get her out of harm's way. But the man grabs the child by the neck and tries to lift her out of the chair.
Everyone in the restaurant panics.
It happened so fast. You don't know, is he gonna jump in with the gun, with the knife? Or what is he gonna do? It was quite a shock. Tables flew, glass broke. It's a scary situation.
He is brutal, brazen, and desperate.
Having boys of my own, if somebody had to take your child away or kidnap, you can't describe what would go through your mind.
But nothing is stopping this man. He refuses to let go of the girl.
We don't know what his intentions are. Has he been stalking this child? Does he have ties to child trafficking, to organized crime? We don't know. We do know that he wants this child and he is determined to take her.
The frantic mother pleads for help.
She's thinking, I've got to protect my baby. I don't care if I have to give my own life. This man is not going to take my child from me.
And that's when Dishal decides he has to do something.
Because it was a little girl, instinct came alive in me. I had to do something to just save this child.
In the blink of an eye, Dishal races over to the would-be kidnapper, putting him in a rear hold, a move commonly used in martial arts.
You're in the back of the opponent, you get control of him, you can see what he's doing, he can't see what you're doing. That's what makes it a very effective movie. But he did put up a fight because he was pretty strong.
Still, the man is no match for Dishal's martial arts training.
I've got a black belt in traditional jiu-jitsu. The whole point of doing martial arts is that you can use it when it's needed. And in this situation, it was a perfect opportunity to use something that I've learned all these years. It was to control him, pin him down.
In jiu-jitsu, the practice is to use your opponent's force against them. And that's exactly what Dishal does.
He takes this guy down and pins him. And this is a big guy, but this restaurant owner, he knows what he's doing.
When I get that locks really in, I held him for 40 to 50 seconds.
Luckily, security guards patrolling the nearby shopping center see the attack and run over to help.
They were the first one on the scene. They radioed or called in the police. They pulled me off from him and handcuffed him, and the community police arrived.
The mother, who has been watching helplessly, clings to her child as bystanders rush them away from the scene. Police take the screaming suspect outside and identify him as Nassim Slamang. He offers no explanation for his actions, but it turns out he's a wanted man with a record of petty theft.
But we don't know if this is the first time that this perpetrator tried to abduct a child. We don't know if this person has stalked others. We don't know if he's harassed others. It's likely that there are more things that we don't know about him.
Once the perpetrator was detained, I went to see the family and see the mom and see the child. The child was traumatized. She couldn't stop crying. We tried to console her as much as we could. Being in that mom's shoes, I can only imagine the trauma that she and the child experienced. It's going to be part of them for a very, very long time.
By the next day, the disturbing video has gone viral.
The public is reminded to remain vigilant. A recent video making the rounds on social media horrifically depicts this.
And Dishal is hailed as a hero.
It was quite a shock and a surprise to me that the video had gone out and gone as viral as it did. I just started receiving these calls and these messages and emails, and everyone just asking me what's happening.
After police review the security footage, Slamang is charged with assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm and attempted kidnapping. But it's the chilling thought of what could have happened that haunts witnesses.
It takes milliseconds for something like that to happen. If you don't react as fast as you have to react, you never know where the child could have been today.
If he got away with this child could have been sexually abused, could have been sold into child trafficking. You think about the worst case scenario that could have happened to this child if he got away with her.
She probably would have not even been in South Africa.
To this day, people think of Dishal as a hero.
When someone decides to be a good Samaritan, they are putting their own life on the line. They are knowingly saying, I may die, but I'm gonna help this other person.
But he's humble about all the attention.
For me, it's just human nature to help another human. You risk your life to save someone's life.
And the best reward for Dishal? The mother is so grateful to him, she and her children are still regular customers.
At least once a month, they come into the restaurant, sit down, have a meal, and I get to chat to them. We become more as friends long term than just a customer. I'm just glad I could have done what I did just to help her. I'm no hero, I'm just a normal South African doing his day-to-day duties. If something like that had to happen to my kid, I would hope that somebody would have done what I done in that situation.
The warrant came through quietly, signed without ceremony, because there was no appetite for spectacle, only a need to move before the fragile alignment of time and cooperation slipped out of reach again, and when investigators returned to the land outside town they did so with a different posture. Slower, more deliberate, measuring not just distance but intent, because places remember things people try to forget. They focused on an area that looked untouched, a shallow depression partially obscured by brush, the soil packed unevenly as if disturbed and then left to settle without care, and it wasn't dramatic, there were no obvious markers screaming for attention, but that was the point. Subtlety lasts longer than violence when the goal is disappearance, and as the first layers of dirt were removed, the air shifted, heavy with anticipation and something else harder to name. Nothing surfaced immediately, and the absence pressed down harder than discovery would have, because silence has weight when it resists explanation, but patience is a discipline in cold case work, and investigators stayed with it, sifting, documenting, refusing to rush the moment. Knowing that whatever remained here had survived decades of weather and neglect, and deserved to be treated with care rather than desperation. Hours passed, then days, and what emerged was not a body, not a definitive answer, but fragments, material that didn't belong where it was found, fibers inconsistent with the surrounding environment, traces that suggested human presence where there should have been none. And it was enough to justify expanding the search, enough to transform suspicion into something more concrete, something that could be articulated without sounding like guesswork. The discovery rippled outward, contained but impossible to hide completely, and when word reached the suspect that the land had been searched again, his reaction was immediate, a request for legal counsel, a shift from casual cooperation to guarded silence, and while that choice was his right, it spoke volumes in a case built largely on what people chose not to say. Media pressure intensified, cameras appearing at the edges of town, reporters hungry for angles, for statements, for something that could be distilled into a headline, and law enforcement pushed back, aware that public noise could contaminate witnesses and distort memory. But the phrase cold case cracked had already escaped into circulation, and with it came expectations that reality was rarely able to satisfy cleanly. Inside the investigation, focus narrowed further onto motive, because opportunity had been established, proximity mapped, inconsistencies documented, but motive is what turns suspicion into narrative, and narrative is what juries understand, and as detectives dug deeper into old relationships, financial records, and personal histories, a picture began to form of a conflict that had simmered quietly before boiling over. There were disputes that had never reached police reports, tensions that stayed behind closed doors, and a pattern of control that seemed mundane at the time but now read differently, less like personality and more like warning signs missed, and when combined with the timing of her disappearance, it painted a scenario that felt tragically plausible, a private escalation ending in irreversible consequences. The suspect's alibi was re-examined piece by piece, each claim tested against newly available data, and cracks widened under pressure, a receipt that didn't align with a timestamp, a witness who now recalled the visit happening on a different day. Small discrepancies that alone could be dismissed but together eroded credibility, turning certainty into doubt. One former acquaintance, long reluctant to get involved, finally agreed to speak on record, and their account added another layer, a recollection of the suspect asking questions after the disappearance that felt less like concern and more like reconnaissance, probing what had been found, what hadn't, and how seriously authorities were taking the case, and that curiosity lingered uncomfortably when viewed through the lens of guilt. For the family, updates came in careful increments, information filtered to protect both the investigation and their emotional well-being, but even limited knowledge was enough to reopen old grief, because every step toward answers forces a reckoning with what those answers might entail. And they balanced hope against the fear that resolution could bring a different kind of pain. The forensic analysis of recovered materials moved slowly, constrained by degradation and the limits of what science can resurrect from the past, but each result, even inconclusive ones, helped refine the story. Ruling out scenarios that once seemed possible and reinforcing the idea that the disappearance was not an accident, not a voluntary vanishing, but an act carried out with intention and followed by concealment. As attention intensified, so did scrutiny of the original investigation, and uncomfortable questions surfaced about missed opportunities, about why certain areas weren't searched, why some statements weren't pursued more aggressively, and while hindsight is an unforgiving lens. The examination was necessary, not to assign blame, but to understand how silence had been allowed to stretch for 35 years. The suspect remained out of public view, shielded by counsel, his life suddenly constricted by attention he hadn't faced before, and those who knew him watched closely, searching past interactions for signs they might have ignored, and in that process, the town itself underwent a quiet transformation, shifting from passive observer to participant in a story that refused to stay buried. Late one night, as investigators compiled their findings into a coherent narrative, a call came in from an analyst reviewing old phone records, a detail flag that hadn't been obvious before. A call placed near the time of the disappearance from a location that intersected both the suspect's movements and the newly searched land, and while the content of the call was unknowable, its existence tightened the timeline further, reducing the space for coincidence. The case was no longer defined by absence alone, it was defined by accumulation, by the steady weight of details pressing in from all sides, and as that pressure mounted, so did the risk, because pushing too hard could fracture cooperation, but moving too slowly could let momentum slip away. And balancing those forces became the central challenge. As dawn broke over the town, casting long shadows across streets that had carried this story for decades, it was clear that the investigation had crossed a threshold, from reopening to reckoning, and whatever followed would demand not just evidence, but endurance. Because cold cases don't end when a suspect is named, they end when truth is strong enough to stand on its own. And somewhere between the land that gave up its fragments and the files that yielded their secrets, the silence continued to thin, stretched taut by years of avoidance and finally forced to confront the weight of what it had been holding back all along. The phone records became the spine of the next phase, thin lines of data stretching back into an era when calls were tethered to places rather than people, when location meant something concrete. And as analysts reconstructed those patterns, they began to see movement where the suspect claimed there had been stillness, activity where he insisted there had been routine, and each connection tightened the narrative, reducing the space where innocence could comfortably exist. One call in particular refused to fade into the background, placed late in the afternoon on the day she disappeared, brief, unremarkable in duration, but its origin placed it uncomfortably close to the service road where her car was later found. And that proximity challenged the suspect's account of his whereabouts, forcing a question he had never convincingly answered: why he was there at all. When confronted through counsel with this detail, the response was careful, hedged, framed as a misunderstanding of technology, a limitation of records, but the explanation didn't address the core issue, which wasn't precision, it was presence, and in cold cases, presence is often the most damning thing left when time has erased everything else. Investigators widened the lens, examining not just what happened on the day she vanished, but what happened in the weeks leading up to it, because crimes rarely erupt without prelude, and patterns began to emerge, a series of encounters that grew more tense, more private, more charged, culminating in that final afternoon when routine broke apart so completely. Witnesses who had once downplayed their observations now revisited them with new seriousness, remembering raised voices, abrupt departures, a sense of urgency that felt misplaced at the time, and while memory is an unreliable ally, the consistency of these recollections added weight, forming a chorus of unease that grew harder to ignore. The suspect's history came under sharper focus, not in search of unrelated wrongdoing, but for context, for a framework that could explain escalation, and what emerged was a pattern of volatility that had been normalized, excused as temperament, tolerated until it brushed too close to harm. And the realization that warning signs had been present but unheeded cast a long shadow over the town's collective conscience. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began evaluating the case, not with the optimism of television dramas but with the skepticism demanded by decades of delay, asking whether the story could survive cross-examination, whether the evidence, largely circumstantial, could withstand the scrutiny of a courtroom, and whether justice delayed could still be justice delivered. The answer wasn't clear, but the direction was, because even if charges never came, the act of naming a suspect, of publicly acknowledging a likely perpetrator, had already altered the moral landscape, shifting the burden from mystery to accountability, and that shift mattered, especially to a family that had lived too long with uncertainty. As legal considerations advanced, investigators continued to press for corroboration, revisiting financial records that hinted at stress, debts that coincided with the timeline, pressures that might have exacerbated an already volatile situation, and while none of it proved motive on its own, it provided context, a plausible reason for desperation to curdle into violence. The suspect remained silent publicly, his absence from community spaces conspicuous, and those who once defended him grew quieter, less certain, because doubt has a way of spreading once it's given permission to exist, and the town, long accustomed to half answers, found itself confronting the discomfort of clarity without resolution. The family's response evolved as well, grief reshaped by validation, anger tempered by exhaustion, and while they avoided public statements, their presence at briefings spoke volumes, a reminder that behind every cold case is a life interrupted, not an abstract puzzle. And that reminder grounded the investigation in something more human than headlines. Forensic reanalysis yielded limited but meaningful results, ruling out alternative suspects that had once loomed large, narrowing the field until the suspect's name stood increasingly alone, and that isolation was perhaps the most powerful evidence of all, because it suggested that the truth, however incomplete, had been hiding in plain sight all along. Late one evening, a detective revisited the earliest days of the case, reading through transcripts with the patience born of years, and noticed something else that had been missed, a gap in the suspect's timeline that had never been filled, an hour unaccounted for. Dismissed as insignificant at the time, but now impossible to ignore, and in that hour, everything could have happened. Attempts to clarify that gap were met with resistance, the suspect declining further interviews, relying on legal protections, and while that was expected, it also marked a turning point, because cooperation, once offered freely, had evaporated precisely when questions grew most pointed. The media narrative shifted accordingly, from cautious optimism to pointed scrutiny, and the phrase "suspect named after 35 years" carried an edge now, implying not just delay but inevitability, a sense that the story had been moving toward this conclusion whether anyone wanted it to or not. As the investigation pressed on, the emotional toll became evident, not just on the family and the suspect, but on investigators themselves, who carried the weight of past failures and present expectations, balancing empathy with objectivity, driven by the knowledge that time was both their enemy and their only ally. The case approached a moment of decision, whether to move forward with charges or accept the limitations imposed by history, and that decision loomed heavy, because it would define how the story ended, either as a legal reckoning or as a moral one, and neither outcome promised simplicity. Outside, the town settled into an uneasy quiet, routines resumed but altered, conversations careful, glances lingering a little longer than before, because when a cold case stirs, it doesn't just reveal one person's secrets, it exposes a community's capacity to look away. And as the silence that once protected those secrets continued to erode, the question shifted from who might be responsible to what it would take, finally, to speak the truth out loud, no matter how long it had waited. The decision to proceed hovered in a narrow space between law and conscience, because by now the case was no longer about discovery, it was about whether what had been discovered could survive the weight of a courtroom, and prosecutors knew that time, the very thing that had preserved the mystery, was also the defense's most reliable ally. They began assembling the story the way juries hear it, not as fragments but as a sequence, one event leaning into the next, opportunity folding into motive, motive into action, and action into silence, and in that sequence the suspect's name surfaced again and again, not as a coincidence, but as a constant, an anchor point around which every unresolved question seemed to orbit. The absence of a body loomed over every discussion, a gap that could never be fully bridged by inference, and yet cold cases without remains had been prosecuted before, not easily, not often, but enough to remind everyone involved that absence doesn't always mean doubt, it means responsibility. A heavier burden carried by those seeking justice. Investigators revisited the final confirmed sighting, reconstructing the minutes leading up to her disappearance with obsessive care, mapping movements, estimating travel times, challenging assumptions that had gone untested in 1988, and what emerged was a window narrower than anyone had realized. A span of time in which only one person could plausibly account for the events that followed. The suspect's refusal to fill that window with explanation left it open to interpretation, and interpretation, when grounded in evidence, becomes argument, and argument becomes a case, but everyone understood the risk, because defense attorneys thrive on uncertainty, on the erosion of memory, on the suggestion that what feels obvious now was anything but back then. Behind the scenes, discussions turned to the ethical weight of reopening wounds, of subjecting the family to another cycle of anticipation and potential disappointment, and yet there was also the recognition that silence had already done its damage. That leaving the truth unspoken was its own kind of cruelty. The community's reaction deepened into something more introspective, conversations shifting from speculation to accountability, from who might have done it to who might have known something and said nothing, and that self-examination was uncomfortable. Because it forced people to confront the social dynamics that allow harm to hide behind familiarity. Old friendships frayed under the strain, alliances reevaluated, because in small towns history is shared, and when that history is questioned, loyalty becomes complicated, and the suspect, once buffered by routine and recognition, now existed in a liminal space. Neither accused in court nor absolved in public. The investigative team felt the pressure acutely, aware that momentum could be lost not through inaction but through misstep, a single error capable of undoing years of careful reconstruction, and so they moved deliberately, double-checking every claim, every document, every inference. Because in cold cases, precision is the difference between resolution and regret. As part of that precision, they sought independent review, fresh eyes unburdened by the case's history, and those reviewers reached similar conclusions, that while the evidence was circumstantial, its accumulation was persuasive, that the story it told was coherent, and that the suspect's narrative struggled to compete with it. The suspect's legal team responded by challenging not just the evidence but the process, questioning the motives behind reopening the case, implying desperation, bias, and the influence of media pressure, and while those arguments were expected, they underscored the fragile balance between justice and perception. The family prepared themselves for any outcome, guarded against hope even as it crept in uninvited, because they had learned the cost of expectation, and yet the knowledge that the case was being taken seriously, that it was no longer a footnote but a focal point, brought a measure of validation they had been denied for decades. As weeks turned into months, the investigation reached its practical limits, no new witnesses emerged, no hidden cache of evidence surfaced, and the question narrowed to a single point, whether what they had was enough, not to satisfy curiosity, but to meet the standard of proof required to act. In the end, the decision reflected the complexity of the case, charges were considered but held in reserve, the suspect formally named and documented, the findings preserved, the narrative entered into the official record in a way it never had been before. And while that fell short of the dramatic resolution many expected, it marked a turning point, a shift from silence to acknowledgement. The announcement was measured, careful with language, avoiding absolutes, and yet its impact was undeniable, because for the first time, the disappearance was framed not as an unsolvable mystery but as a crime with a likely perpetrator, and that framing altered how the story would be remembered. Public reaction was divided, some calling it justice delayed, others calling it insufficient, but beneath those debates was a shared understanding that something fundamental had changed, the case had been given a voice again, and that voice could no longer be ignored. For investigators, the work didn't end with the announcement, files remained open, evidence preserved, avenues documented for future review, because cold cases have a way of resurfacing when technology advances or when conscience loosens. And leaving the door open was an act of humility as much as strategy. The suspect retreated further from public view, his name now permanently linked to the case, and whether guilt would ever be legally established remained uncertain, but socially, historically, the narrative had shifted, and that shift carried consequences no courtroom could fully contain. As the town adjusted to this new reality, the absence at the center of the story remained, unresolved and irreducible, a reminder that even when silence breaks, it doesn't always yield closure. Sometimes it yields something harder, the truth without conclusion. And in that space, between what was known and what could be proven, the case settled into a new phase, no longer frozen, no longer dormant, but alive in a way it hadn't been since 1988, waiting, patient, for whatever came next. Time slowed after the announcement, not in reality but in perception, because once the words were spoken publicly there was nothing left to distract from their weight, and the town found itself living inside the aftermath. A space where certainty was replaced by vigilance, and every familiar street felt slightly altered by what it now represented. The suspect's name settled into conversation like an unwelcome guest, present even when unmentioned, and people began replaying old memories with new context, searching for signs they might have missed, moments that now felt charged with implication, and this retrospective scrutiny was relentless. Because understanding the past became a way to protect the present. For some, denial remained a refuge, the insistence that without a trial, without a verdict, nothing was truly resolved, and while that position held legal merit, it failed to quiet the moral unease that lingered, because the evidence, incomplete as it was, refused to fade back into obscurity. The family navigated this period with cautious resolve, declining interviews, choosing privacy over validation, but those close to them described a subtle shift, a release of tension that had been constant for decades, because being believed, even without a courtroom resolution, offered a form of relief that silence never could. Investigators continued to receive tips, most of them redundant, some speculative, a few unsettling, and each was evaluated with the same care, because even now the case remained open in spirit if not in momentum, and the possibility that one overlooked detail could change everything still loomed. One such tip led back to the suspect's circle in the late 80s, to a person who had long avoided attention, whose connection to the case was indirect but persistent, and when approached, that person's hesitation spoke louder than their words, because fear ages differently than memory. And theirs had not diminished with time. In a guarded conversation, they admitted to hearing something years ago, a partial confession wrapped in bravado and alcohol, dismissed at the time as exaggeration, but now heavy with implication, and while the statement lacked corroboration, it added another layer to the narrative. Another voice echoing the same unsettling theme. The legal system, however, demands more than echoes, and prosecutors weighed the new information carefully, aware that unreliable testimony could weaken rather than strengthen the case. And the tension between pursuing every lead and protecting the integrity of the story became increasingly difficult to manage. Meanwhile, the suspect's life continued under a shadow that could not be easily dispelled, employment strained, relationships frayed, and the quiet isolation that followed was its own kind of punishment, whether deserved or not, because public suspicion operates independently of legal outcomes. The town's institutions responded in their own ways, schools revisiting safety protocols, community groups holding forums on accountability and prevention, and while none of these actions could change the past, they reflected a collective desire to learn from it, to ensure that silence would not be the default response again. Investigators documented the new tip, cross-referenced it with existing evidence, and while it did not trigger immediate action, it reinforced a pattern that had become impossible to ignore, that multiple, independent threads pointed in the same direction, converging on a single narrative despite originating from different places. The passage of time had eroded many things, but it had also stripped away distractions, leaving behind the core of the story, a disappearance facilitated by familiarity, enabled by hesitation, and preserved by a community's reluctance to confront uncomfortable possibilities. As months passed, the case receded from headlines but not from memory, and that quiet persistence mattered, because cold cases often fail not for lack of evidence but for lack of attention, and attention, once withdrawn, is difficult to reclaim. The family marked another anniversary privately, aware that this one felt different, not because it brought closure, but because it brought recognition, a public acknowledgement that what they had insisted on for decades was not a fantasy but a credible account of loss and injustice. Investigators remained on standby, files accessible, evidence cataloged, ready for the moment when technology or testimony might finally tip the balance, and that readiness was an act of faith, a belief that truth, however delayed, has a way of resurfacing. The suspect's silence persisted, unbroken, and while some interpreted it as legal strategy, others saw it as something else entirely, an inability or unwillingness to confront what had been done, and that interpretation, though subjective, fed the narrative that had already taken hold. In the background, the land outside town remained unchanged, indifferent to human drama, its quiet a reminder that places absorb secrets without protest, and that uncovering them requires more than tools, it requires persistence, courage, and a willingness to look where others have looked away. The story, now stripped of urgency but heavy with implication, continued to exist in a state of suspension, neither resolved nor forgotten, and in that suspension lay its power, a reminder that justice is not always a single moment but a prolonged reckoning. As the years pressed forward, the case settled into its new identity, no longer an unsolved mystery but a documented crime with a named suspect, a distinction that mattered, because it changed how the past would be taught, discussed, and remembered. And in that change, subtle but enduring, the silence that had once protected the unknown finally lost its grip, replaced by a vigilance that refused to let the story fade again, no matter how long resolution might take. The case lived on in fragments, not as a headline but as a presence, resurfacing in unexpected places, a comment made too casually, a look held too long, a pause in conversation when the past edged too close to the present, and that persistence mattered because it kept pressure alive. Subtle but unrelenting, the kind that seeps into routines and erodes the comfort of pretending nothing happened. Investigators noticed it too, the way people spoke more carefully now, the way certain names carried a different weight, and while no dramatic breakthroughs followed, the environment itself had changed, because fear of being wrong had finally been outweighed by fear of staying silent. And that shift opened doors that had been closed for decades. One of those doors led back to a storage facility on the outskirts of a neighboring county, a place tied loosely to the suspect through a former associate, and while the connection was tenuous, it warranted attention, because cold cases survive on the willingness to pursue even the thinnest threads. Especially when they align with known gaps in the story. Records showed a unit rented under a variation of the suspect's name shortly after the disappearance, paid in cash, vacated within months, and dismissed at the time as irrelevant, but now, with hindsight as a guide, it raised uncomfortable questions about what might have been stored there, and why it had been relinquished so quickly. The unit itself yielded little, emptied long ago, scrubbed clean by time and turnover, but the act of revisiting it sparked a new wave of reflection, because it highlighted how many opportunities had been missed simply because the urgency of the moment had demanded focus elsewhere. And those missed moments now formed a constellation of regret. As the investigation expanded its scope, attention returned to the service road, the place where the story began, and fresh analysis of traffic patterns from the era, limited as they were, suggested a level of familiarity that contradicted the idea of a random encounter, reinforcing the theory that whoever orchestrated the disappearance knew the area well enough to exploit its isolation. Witnesses who had once framed their observations as guesses now spoke with greater confidence, not because their memories had sharpened, but because the context had shifted, and what once felt ambiguous now felt significant, and while that didn't change the facts, it changed how those facts were understood. The suspect's continued withdrawal became its own point of discussion, his absence from public life interpreted in countless ways, and while legal counsel advised restraint, the silence fed speculation, because in a story defined by years of unspoken truths, quiet was no longer neutral. Prosecutors revisited the possibility of convening a grand jury, not as a promise of indictment, but as a means of compelling testimony, of placing the story under oath, and the debate around that option reflected the broader tension of the case. The desire for action balanced against the risk of failure. The family was consulted, not asked to decide but informed, because any step forward would ripple outward, affecting not just legal outcomes but emotional ones, and their response was measured, shaped by decades of disappointment, yet anchored by the belief that even an imperfect attempt at justice was better than perpetual silence. Community forums resumed quietly, not as spectacles but as conversations, spaces where people shared concerns, regrets, and a cautious determination to do better, and while these gatherings didn't produce evidence, they produced something else. A collective acknowledgement that the past had been mishandled, and that acknowledgement carried its own kind of weight. Investigators documented these shifts, understanding that context matters, that the story of a crime is shaped not only by what happened but by how it was received, ignored, or confronted, and this case, long defined by avoidance, was finally being met with engagement. Technology continued to advance in the background, forensic methods evolving, databases expanding, and while no immediate breakthroughs emerged, the possibility of future analysis lingered, a reminder that time, once the enemy, could still become an ally. The suspect aged quietly, his connection to the case cemented in public record, and whether guilt would ever be proven beyond doubt remained uncertain, but the erosion of anonymity was irreversible, because names, once spoken, do not easily return to silence. As the years pressed on, the case became a reference point, cited in discussions about cold cases, investigative persistence, and the cost of hesitation, and that role ensured its survival in collective memory, preventing it from slipping back into obscurity. The land, the road, the town, all remained, carrying the imprint of a story that refused to conclude, and in that refusal lay its power, because unresolved truth demands attention, demanding that those who inherit it decide what to do with its weight. The silence that once suffocated the case had been replaced by something more active, a vigilance that did not promise answers but refused to accept forgetting as an option, and that vigilance became the legacy of a disappearance that had shaped a community for more than 3 decades. And as the story continued to hover between resolution and restraint, one truth remained undeniable, that the past, once disturbed, does not return quietly, it lingers, asking to be reckoned with, again and again. Until someone finally listens closely enough to hear what it has been trying to say all along. The phone rang just after midnight, the kind of ring that slices through sleep like a blade, sharp, deliberate, unforgiving, and on the other end was a voice that didn't bother with introductions, didn't soften the words, didn't explain the reason for calling so late. Only said a name that hadn't been spoken out loud in this town for 35 years, a name buried under dust and denials and the quiet agreement that some questions were better left unanswered, and in that moment, the silence that had ruled since 1988 finally cracked, not loudly, not cleanly, but with a sound like bone giving way under pressure, because this was Texas, because this was a cold case, because everyone thought the past had already decided to stay dead. Back in the summer of 1988, the heat came early and stayed too long, pressing down on the flat stretches of land outside the town limits, turning the air thick and slow, the kind of heat that makes people irritable and reckless and careless with their secrets. And it was in that heat that she disappeared, not in the middle of the night, not during some dramatic struggle, but on an ordinary afternoon that should have ended with dinner on the table and lights on in the living room. An afternoon that instead dissolved into one of the most haunting missing person cases the county had ever seen. Her car was found first, parked crooked at the edge of a service road that cut through scrubland and abandoned oil equipment, the driver's door unlocked, the keys missing, no sign of a struggle obvious enough to make headlines but just enough wrong to make investigators uneasy. Because nothing about the scene explained where she went, how she left, or why no one heard anything, and the town noticed immediately, because in places like this, absence is loud, louder than any scream, louder than any siren, louder than the truth people pretend not to know. She was known here, not famous, not notorious, just familiar, the kind of person whose routines were predictable, whose face belonged in the background of everyday life, and when she didn't show up the next day, and the next, and the next, neighbors started talking, then whispering, then speculating in the low, cautious way people do when they're afraid of being wrong but even more afraid of being right, and the words cold case weren't used yet, not officially, but the feeling was already there, creeping in like dusk. The initial investigation moved fast, too fast in hindsight, patrol cars circling dirt roads, deputies knocking on doors, questions asked and answers taken down in notebooks already slick with sweat, and there were witnesses, or at least people who thought they had seen something. A truck idling too long, a man standing by the road when no one else should have been there, a flash of movement where movement didn't belong, but nothing lined up cleanly, nothing stayed solid under scrutiny, and every lead seemed to collapse into another dead end before the ink had even dried. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the urgency drained out of the search like water through cracked ground, posters faded on telephone poles, tips slowed, hope thinned, and somewhere along the way the case slipped into a familiar category, unsolved, inactive, cold. A word that sounds clinical until you realize it means the questions are still burning but no one is left holding them. For the family, time didn't soften anything, it sharpened it. Every birthday that passed without her, every holiday with an empty chair, every rumor that resurfaced only to sink again, and for the town, the case became a kind of background noise, a story told to newcomers in hushed tones. A warning wrapped in folklore, because everyone knew something bad had happened, but no one could agree on who carried it out, or why the truth never surfaced. Years later, files were boxed and moved, evidence sealed and shelved, detectives retired, memories blurred, but the case never fully disappeared. It lingered in conversations and court records and late-night radio segments about unsolved crimes. Always with the same unresolved question hanging at the end, and always with the same uncomfortable detail that there were names written down back then, names circled, names crossed out, names never officially accused but never completely cleared either. One of those names sat quietly in the background for decades, untouched by charges, shielded by time, by lack of evidence, by the convenient erosion of certainty, and every so often, someone would mention it, usually after a drink or two, usually followed by a shrug and a quick change of subject. Because in this town, suspicion without proof was a dangerous thing, and the past had a way of fighting back when disturbed. As the years stacked up, technology changed, methods evolved, cold cases across the country were being reopened, re-examined, solved, and the question started to creep back into the local consciousness, not loudly, not publicly, but insistently. Could this one still speak? Could something still be hiding in the silence? And that question sat unanswered until a routine review, a box reopened, a detail reconsidered, a piece of information that had once seemed insignificant suddenly caught in a different light. The break didn't come with flashing lights or a dramatic confession. It came quietly, almost apologetically, through paperwork, impatience, and a willingness to look again at what everyone thought they already understood, and when the suspect's name was finally spoken out loud, not as a rumor, not as speculation, but as an official point of interest, it sent a shock through a community that had long convinced itself the truth would never surface. Because naming a suspect after 35 years isn't closure, it's an earthquake. It rattles old foundations, it reopens wounds, it forces people to remember where they were, what they said, what they didn't say, and why some things were left alone for so long. And suddenly the cold case wasn't cold anymore, it was alive, breathing, and staring back at everyone who thought they were safely on the other side of time. And as the town reeled, as whispers turned into headlines, as the past pushed its way back into the present, one thing became painfully clear: this story wasn't over, not even close, because when silence finally breaks, it doesn't do so gently, it fractures. And whatever comes out next is never as simple as anyone hopes. By morning the name was everywhere, whispered in kitchens, murmured at gas pumps, typed cautiously into local forums where people pretended to ask questions while really testing how far the truth might stretch without snapping. And what made it worse was not just who the suspect was, but how ordinary the revelation felt, how neatly it slid into stories people had been telling themselves for decades without ever daring to connect the dots, because this was the man who had been around back then. The man whose truck had been mentioned more than once, the man whose temper was a running joke until it wasn't funny anymore. In 1988 he lived close enough to matter and far enough to be overlooked, worked jobs that kept him moving, places that didn't demand records or references, and when investigators first spoke to him he answered the way people do when they think the questions are temporary, polite, cooperative. Almost bored, and the notes taken that day described nothing remarkable, no inconsistencies loud enough to ring alarms, no confession hiding between the lines, just another interview in a growing stack that would eventually be sealed and forgotten. What changed wasn't the past, it was the way the past was read, because buried in those early reports were details that had been glossed over in the rush to move forward, a timeline that didn't quite line up, a statement that contradicted another witness by a matter of minutes. A phone call placed and then denied, and taken alone none of it was enough, but together they formed a pattern that had been invisible until someone decided to stop treating the case like a relic and started treating it like a living thing. The renewed investigation didn't announce itself, it crept in quietly, a detective assigned part-time, then full-time, records pulled from storage, photographs scanned, tape recordings digitized, and with every layer peeled back the story grew less clean, less accidental, and far more deliberate than anyone had wanted to believe in 1988, because this wasn't just a woman who vanished, this was a disappearance shaped by proximity, familiarity, and opportunity. They went back to the car, not the physical vehicle long since gone, but the scene as it had been captured, the angle of the tires, the absence of skid marks, the lack of fingerprints where there should have been plenty, and suddenly the idea that she left willingly felt thinner, less convincing. Especially when paired with witness statements that had once been dismissed as unreliable, a figure seen near the service road, a truck matching is parked too close for comfort, an argument overheard earlier that week that no one wanted to take seriously at the time. The town resisted at first, because reopening the case meant reopening memories people had learned to live without, and more importantly it meant accepting that the danger might not have been some nameless outsider passing through, but someone woven into the fabric of everyday life. Someone who had shared beers, borrowed tools, nodded politely in passing, and the idea of that kind of proximity made everyone uncomfortable in a way that time alone couldn't fix. As investigators retraced steps, they spoke to people who hadn't spoken in years, voices older, slower, more cautious now, but also heavier with regret, because time does strange things to memory, it erases details while sharpening emotions. And more than one person admitted they had known something was wrong back then but had convinced themselves it wasn't their place to say anything, not without proof, not without risking being wrong, not without becoming the next name whispered behind closed doors. One woman remembered seeing her the day she disappeared, remembered the look on her face, distracted, tense, like she was trying to get somewhere quickly without being obvious about it. And that memory had sat untouched for years because it hadn't fit the prevailing narrative of a random disappearance, but now it slid into place with alarming ease, another small piece locking into a picture no one wanted complete. Another witness came forward with something even more unsettling, a recollection of a conversation overheard weeks before the disappearance, words exchanged in anger, a threat half laughed and half meant, the kind of thing people say when they don't expect consequences. And back then it had been shrugged off as bluster, but now it echoed with a different weight, a different implication, because threats have a way of aging badly when paired with absence. The suspect himself hadn't vanished, hadn't fled, hadn't lived a life of shadows, he stayed close, worked, aged, blended in, and when detectives finally approached him again, decades after that first polite interview, the shock wasn't that he remembered the case. It was how quickly he tried to distance himself from it, how carefully he chose his words, how often he emphasized things he thought mattered while avoiding the ones that didn't, and seasoned investigators noticed the shift immediately. The difference between someone with nothing to hide and someone who knows exactly what questions he hopes won't be asked. Still, naming a suspect isn't the same as proving guilt, and the case remained fragile, balanced on circumstantial threads and human memory, two things the justice system treats with caution for good reason, and yet the momentum was undeniable, because for the first time in 35 years, the story was moving forward instead of looping endlessly back on itself. Local media seized on the development, headlines flaring with the words cold case and suspect named, reporters revisiting old footage, grainy photographs of a younger woman smiling at the camera, unaware of what waited ahead, and the community watched with a mix of relief and dread. Because answers are comforting in theory but terrifying in practice, especially when they threaten to implicate someone you once trusted. The family was notified quietly, carefully, the way these conversations always are, and their reaction wasn't celebration, it wasn't even relief, it was something closer to exhaustion, a weariness born of decades spent suspended between hope and despair. And while the naming of a suspect validated what they had felt all along, that something had been missed, something overlooked, it also reopened a wound they had spent years learning how not to touch. As the investigation pressed on, the question of evidence loomed large, because time is rarely kind to physical proof, and whatever had once existed was now scattered, degraded, or gone entirely, leaving detectives to rely on reconstruction, inference, and the careful weaving together of testimony old and new, a process as meticulous as it was emotionally charged, because every step forward carried the weight of 3.5 decades of silence. And yet, there was something else, something that hadn't been there before, a sense of inevitability, a feeling that the truth, whatever it was, had reached a point where it could no longer remain buried without effort, and effort leaves traces, effort creates mistakes. And those mistakes have a way of surfacing when people least expect them to. Late one evening, as files were reviewed yet again, a detail surfaced that hadn't drawn attention in years, a note scribbled in the margin of an old report referencing a location that hadn't been fully searched, dismissed at the time due to lack of manpower and competing priorities, and now, with fresh eyes and renewed determination, that oversight felt less like an accident and more like an opportunity missed. The location sat miles outside town, unremarkable, easy to overlook, and tied loosely to the suspect through property records and old employment logs, a place that fit too neatly into the gaps in the timeline to ignore any longer, and as investigators prepared to follow that thread, the tension in the case tightened, because whatever waited there, answers or nothing at all, would change the direction of the story permanently. The town felt it too, that subtle shift, the sense that something long dormant was stirring, that the past was no longer content to remain a cautionary tale but was demanding resolution, and as night fell and conversations quieted, the same thought echoed in different forms across different rooms. If the silence has finally broken, what else is about to come spilling out? And somewhere within that growing unease was the understanding that the name spoken after 35 years was only the beginning, not the end, because cold cases don't thaw all at once, they crack slowly, unevenly, revealing layers beneath that no one is fully prepared to confront. The road to the location mentioned in that forgotten margin note was narrow and uneven, cutting through land that looked unchanged since the late 80s, scrub brush clawing at the edges, fences leaning under their own history. The kind of place that doesn't invite questions because it barely seems to exist at all, and as investigators drove out there they understood immediately why it had been skipped the first time, because it didn't look like a crime scene, it looked like nothing. And nothing is easy to dismiss when time is short and pressure is high. Back then the focus had been on urgency, on speed, on finding her alive if that was still possible, and once those early days passed the case slipped into maintenance mode, a cycle of review and stagnation, but now the lens was different, slower, colder, more suspicious. And what once looked empty now looked deliberate, isolated, accessible, and disturbingly convenient, especially when overlaid with the suspect's movements during the hours no one could fully account for. They didn't announce the search publicly, not yet, because hope can turn into spectacle faster than truth, and this case had already suffered enough from noise without substance, so the team moved quietly, marking coordinates, walking the land, photographing depressions in the soil that might mean nothing at all, and yet every step felt heavy, charged with the awareness that this ground had been waiting a long time for someone to pay attention again. The initial sweep found no remains, no obvious evidence, no dramatic discovery to justify the growing tension, and for a moment it felt like history repeating itself, another promising lead dissolving into disappointment, but cold cases rarely give up their secrets all at once. And the real value of the search wasn't what was found immediately, it was what it ruled out, narrowing the possibilities, tightening the narrative, forcing investigators to confront a simpler, more unsettling truth, that whatever happened didn't happen impulsively, it happened with planning. That realization shifted the tone of the investigation, because planning implies intent, and intent points back to motive, and motive had always been the missing piece, whispered about but never solid enough to hold up under scrutiny, until now, when old relationships were re-examined, conversations reinterpreted, and patterns of behavior viewed not as isolated quirks but as part of a larger, darker picture. The suspect's connection to her was no longer treated as incidental, not just a crossing of paths in a small town, but a sustained proximity that offered opportunity after opportunity, and as detectives mapped out those intersections, the timeline grew tighter, less forgiving, showing windows of time where he was unaccounted for, moments where he could have intervened without witnesses, without interruption, and without immediate consequence. When confronted with these inconsistencies, the suspect pushed back gently at first, insisting on memory gaps, on the unreliability of 35-year-old recollections, and on the unfairness of being dragged back into something that had already been investigated. And there was truth in that complaint. Memory does fade, evidence does erode, but the problem wasn't what he couldn't remember, it was what he remembered too well, details that aligned conveniently with his version of events, details that felt rehearsed rather than recalled. Investigators noticed the shifts in his demeanor as interviews progressed, the tightening of his jaw, the sudden defensiveness when certain names were mentioned, the way he deflected questions about specific locations while volunteering irrelevant information elsewhere. And these weren't confessions, they weren't even direct contradictions, but they were cracks, small fractures in a story that had been carried for decades without challenge. Meanwhile, the community reacted in uneven waves, some people clinging to the belief that this was all a mistake, that authorities were desperate for closure and had chosen an easy target, while others admitted, quietly and reluctantly, that the pieces were beginning to make a kind of sense they hadn't wanted to acknowledge before, because acceptance would mean admitting that the danger had never really left, it had just blended in. Old rumors resurfaced with new urgency, stories of arguments, of controlling behavior, of jealousy dismissed at the time as private matters, and while none of it amounted to proof, it painted a backdrop that made the disappearance feel less random and more personal. A shift that unsettled everyone who had once shrugged and moved on. The investigation expanded beyond the town limits, pulling records from neighboring counties, tracking employment histories, checking vehicle registrations, and one detail stood out with uncomfortable clarity. A vehicle similar to the one described by early witnesses had been sold shortly after the disappearance, the paperwork routine, unremarkable on its own, but when viewed alongside the timeline it felt purposeful, a quiet erasure of something that might one day draw attention. Forensic options were limited, but not non-existent, and advances in technology offered at least the possibility of extracting something useful from evidence long thought exhausted, fibers preserved, soil samples compared, patterns analyzed with tools that didn't exist in 1988. And while results were slow, the effort itself sent a message that this case was no longer a relic but an active pursuit of truth. The family watched from a distance, protective of their emotions, wary of hope, because they had lived through false starts before, and each new development carried the risk of another letdown, but the difference this time was the tone, the seriousness, the lack of theatrics. And that alone made it feel more real than anything they had experienced in decades. As weeks passed, the pressure mounted, not just on the suspect but on the investigators themselves, because reopening a cold case is an implicit accusation, a suggestion that something was missed, overlooked, mishandled, and every step forward forced a reevaluation of past decisions. A quiet reckoning with the limits of what could be done then versus what could be done now. One evening, while reviewing interview transcripts side by side, a detective noticed something subtle but telling, a phrase the suspect had used in both interviews, separated by 35 years, identical in wording, identical in placement, a detail so specific it was unlikely to be coincidence. And it raised a troubling question, whether the story had been remembered or memorized. That discovery didn't make headlines, it didn't trigger an arrest, but it reinforced the sense that the truth was closer than it had ever been, that the silence was thinning, stretched tight and ready to tear. And that whatever happened next would test not only the strength of the evidence but the resolve of everyone involved. Outside, life in the town continued, routines uninterrupted, but beneath the surface there was a collective tension, a feeling that the past was no longer safely contained, that it was leaking into the present through documents and memories and questions people had avoided for years. And that once unleashed, it wouldn't retreat easily. The case pressed forward, methodically, deliberately, with no guarantees and no shortcuts, and as investigators prepared to take the next step, seeking warrants, revisiting locations once deemed irrelevant, they understood the stakes clearly, because in cold cases, momentum is fragile. And losing it can mean losing the truth forever. And somewhere between the dusty roads and the quiet offices, between the old notes and the new analyses, the story continued to unfold, pulling everyone closer to an answer that had waited 35 years to be confronted, an answer that promised not comfort, but clarity. And the understanding that some silences endure not because they are empty, but because they are full of things people are afraid to face. The case lived on in fragments, not as a headline but as a presence, resurfacing in unexpected places, a comment made too casually, a look held too long, a pause in conversation when the past edged too close to the present, and that persistence mattered because it kept pressure alive. Subtle but unrelenting, the kind that seeps into routines and erodes the comfort of pretending nothing happened. Investigators noticed it too, the way people spoke more carefully now, the way certain names carried a different weight, and while no dramatic breakthroughs followed, the environment itself had changed, because fear of being wrong had finally been outweighed by fear of staying silent. And that shift opened doors that had been closed for decades. One of those doors led back to a storage facility on the outskirts of a neighboring county, a place tied loosely to the suspect through a former associate, and while the connection was tenuous, it warranted attention, because cold cases survive on the willingness to pursue even the thinnest threads, especially when they align with known gaps in the story. Records showed a unit rented under a variation of the suspect's name shortly after the disappearance, paid in cash, vacated within months, and dismissed at the time as irrelevant. But now, with hindsight as a guide, it raised uncomfortable questions about what might have been stored there, and why it had been relinquished so quickly. The unit itself yielded little, emptied long ago, scrubbed clean by time and turnover, but the act of revisiting it sparked a new wave of reflection, because it highlighted how many opportunities had been missed simply because the urgency of the moment had demanded focus elsewhere. And those missed moments now formed a constellation of regret. As the investigation expanded its scope, attention returned to the service road, the place where the story began, and fresh analysis of traffic patterns from the era, limited as they were, suggested a level of familiarity that contradicted the idea of a random encounter, reinforcing the theory that whoever orchestrated the disappearance knew the area well enough to exploit its isolation. Witnesses who had once framed their observations as guesses now spoke with greater confidence, not because their memories had sharpened, but because the context had shifted, and what once felt ambiguous now felt significant, and while that didn't change the facts, it changed how those facts were understood. The suspect's continued withdrawal became its own point of discussion, his absence from public life interpreted in countless ways, and while legal counsel advised restraint, the silence fed speculation, because in a story defined by years of unspoken truths, quiet was no longer neutral. Prosecutors revisited the possibility of convening a grand jury, not as a promise of indictment, but as a means of compelling testimony, of placing the story under oath, and the debate around that option reflected the broader tension of the case. The desire for action balanced against the risk of failure. The family was consulted, not asked to decide but informed, because any step forward would ripple outward, affecting not just legal outcomes but emotional ones, and their response was measured, shaped by decades of disappointment, yet anchored by the belief that even an imperfect attempt at justice was better than perpetual silence. Community forums resumed quietly, not as spectacles but as conversations, spaces where people shared concerns, regrets, and a cautious determination to do better, and while these gatherings didn't produce evidence, they produced something else. A collective acknowledgement that the past had been mishandled, and that acknowledgement carried its own kind of weight. Investigators documented these shifts, understanding that context matters, that the story of a crime is shaped not only by what happened but by how it was received, ignored, or confronted, and this case, long defined by avoidance, was finally being met with engagement. Technology continued to advance in the background, forensic methods evolving, databases expanding, and while no immediate breakthroughs emerged, the possibility of future analysis lingered, a reminder that time, once the enemy, could still become an ally. The suspect aged quietly, his connection to the case cemented in public record, and whether guilt would ever be proven beyond doubt remained uncertain, but the erosion of anonymity was irreversible, because names, once spoken, do not easily return to silence. As the years pressed on, the case became a reference point, cited in discussions about cold cases, investigative persistence, and the cost of hesitation, and that role ensured its survival in collective memory, preventing it from slipping back into obscurity. The land, the road, the town, all remained, carrying the imprint of a story that refused to conclude, and in that refusal lay its power, because unresolved truth demands attention, demanding that those who inherit it decide what to do with its weight. The silence that once suffocated the case had been replaced by something more active, a vigilance that did not promise answers but refused to accept forgetting as an option, and that vigilance became the legacy of a disappearance that had shaped a community for more than 3 decades. And as the story continued to hover between resolution and restraint, one truth remained undeniable, that the past, once disturbed, does not return quietly, it lingers, asking to be reckoned with, again and again, until someone finally listens closely enough to hear what it has been trying to say all along. The longer the case stayed alive, the more it reshaped the people who carried it, because unresolved truth has a way of demanding energy, focus, and patience, and those who stayed close to it found themselves measuring time differently, not by calendars, but by what had changed and what stubbornly refused to. Investigators rotated in and out, but the core narrative remained, refined rather than replaced, and that continuity mattered, because cold cases fail when stories fracture, when new theories overwrite old ones without understanding them, and here, every addition was layered carefully, preserving what had been learned rather than discarding it. One investigator, nearing retirement, took it upon himself to revisit the case one final time, not to make headlines, but to ensure that nothing essential had been missed, and his approach was almost meditative, rereading transcripts, listening to recordings, absorbing not just words but tone, cadence, hesitation, the subtle markers of discomfort that do not age as quickly as facts. In doing so, he noticed a pattern that had never been formally articulated, a sequence of interactions that suggested escalation, contact becoming more frequent, more private, more intense, and then abruptly ending with her disappearance, and while this pattern had been implicit, naming it clarified the emotional arc of the case in a way that evidence alone had not. That clarity prompted a final round of outreach, not to the usual witnesses, but to peripheral figures, people who had brushed against the story without ever stepping into it, and one of them, long dismissed as irrelevant, offered a recollection that had stayed with them for decades. A moment of discomfort they couldn't explain at the time. They described seeing the suspect near the service road on the afternoon she vanished, not interacting directly, not in a way that demanded attention, but present, waiting, and while the memory lacked precision, it aligned eerily with the reconstructed timeline, reinforcing the sense that the disappearance was not spontaneous, but anticipated. The statement was documented, weighed, and ultimately deemed insufficient to alter legal strategy, but its value lay elsewhere, in the way it reinforced a narrative that had emerged organically from dozens of sources. A convergence that felt less like coincidence and more like truth revealing itself through repetition. As this new account circulated quietly among investigators, discussions returned once more to the possibility of formal charges, not because the evidence had transformed overnight, but because the cumulative effect had reached a threshold, and thresholds matter, even when they do not guarantee success. Prosecutors revisited the file with renewed seriousness, reassessing risk, considering the message that action or inaction would send, and weighing not just the likelihood of conviction, but the ethical responsibility to try. And these deliberations were marked by the understanding that failure in court could foreclose future opportunities. The family was informed again, their response steady, their expectations tempered, because after decades of uncertainty, they had learned to separate validation from outcome, and that separation gave them a strength that surprised even those closest to them. The suspect, through counsel, reiterated his innocence, framing the renewed attention as harassment, as an attempt to rewrite history, and while those claims found some sympathy, they could not erase the record that had been built, the documented inconsistencies, the unanswered questions. The weight of presence. Public opinion remained divided but engaged, and that engagement sustained the case, because justice, even when imperfect, relies on a collective willingness to confront uncomfortable narratives rather than retreat into denial. As the months passed, no dramatic turning point arrived, no confession, no discovery that resolved everything, but the absence of drama did not equate to stagnation, because the case had achieved something rare, it had forced acknowledgement, it had named what had long been left unnamed. That naming altered the future, influencing how similar cases would be handled, how early warnings might be interpreted, how silence might be challenged before it calcified into decades of absence, and in that sense, the case's impact extended beyond its own unresolved core. The town began to mark the disappearance differently, not as a whispered legend but as a documented tragedy, commemorations held with intention rather than rumor, and that shift signaled a maturation of memory, a refusal to let myth replace accountability. Investigators prepared to archive the latest iteration of the file, not as a conclusion, but as a living document, one designed to be reopened when circumstances allowed, and that act of preparation was itself a commitment, an acknowledgement that the story was not finished, only paused. The suspect's name remained in the record, inseparable from the case, a reality that no amount of time could undo, and whether that connection would ever be tested in court remained an open question, but the social and historical verdict had already begun to form. As the case settled into this uneasy equilibrium, the silence that had once defined it felt different, no longer empty, no longer protective, but charged with memory and expectation, a silence that waited, patient and watchful, for whatever came next. And in that waiting lay the final tension of the story so far, the understanding that some truths resist closure not because they are unknowable, but because they demand a reckoning that extends beyond any single moment, beyond any single decision, and into the collective conscience of everyone left behind. The case entered its quietest phase then, the kind that looks like stillness from the outside but feels like pressure from within, because nothing new was announced, no warrant served, no court dates scheduled, and yet every element remained poised, waiting for the smallest shift that could send everything moving again. Inside law enforcement, the file stayed open on desks rather than shelves, referenced in training sessions, revisited during strategy meetings, a reminder that resolution is not always immediate but persistence can be institutional, passed from one set of hands to another without losing intent. Advances in forensic science continue to be monitored closely, particularly in areas that could someday re-examine the fragments recovered from the land, and while current methods yielded no definitive answers, the commitment to preserve those materials reflected a belief that time, once an obstacle, might eventually become an ally again. The family lived within this suspended state with practiced resilience, having learned how to exist alongside unanswered questions, but the difference now was the knowledge that the system had acknowledged their truth, that the disappearance was no longer treated as an inexplicable vanishing but as a crime with a narrative grounded in evidence. Community memory adjusted accordingly, conversations about the case becoming less speculative and more reflective, less about rumor and more about responsibility, and this recalibration mattered, because it demonstrated how acknowledgement alone can reshape collective understanding. The suspect's continued denial became part of the story's texture, not as proof of innocence or guilt, but as a constant counterpoint, a reminder that truth in cold cases is often contested rather than revealed, argued rather than discovered. Those closest to the suspect grappled with their own reckoning, balancing loyalty against doubt, memory against new context, and for some, the weight of reconsideration proved too heavy, relationships distancing not out of certainty but out of discomfort. Because proximity to unresolved harm carries its own cost. Investigators documented everything meticulously, understanding that future reviews would rely on clarity, not recollection, and that documentation was an act of faith in continuity, a belief that someone, someday, would pick up the thread and carry it forward. Public interest ebbed and flowed, influenced by other stories, other crises, but the case never vanished entirely, its presence sustained by anniversaries, by occasional updates, by the simple fact that a named suspect keeps a story alive in ways an unsolved mystery cannot. As time pressed on, the town grew, changed, new residents arriving with little knowledge of the past, and yet the case persisted in subtle ways, in cautionary tales, in institutional memory, in the quiet understanding that some histories shape a place long after the headlines fade. The land outside town remained untouched, preserved more by neglect than protection, but its significance endured, marked in records, mapped in reports, a physical anchor to a story otherwise defined by absence. Investigators reflected privately on what the case had taught them, about patience, about humility, about the limits of certainty, and those lessons informed their work on other cases, improving responses, sharpening instincts, and perhaps preventing future silences from stretching as long. The suspect aged further, time narrowing the window for accountability, and that reality added urgency to preservation efforts, because justice delayed risks becoming justice denied not only by law but by biology. In moments of reflection, those involved recognized that the case had already achieved something rare. It had transformed from an unspeakable absence into a documented wrong, from a whisper into a record, and that transformation carried meaning even without a verdict. As preparations began for what would likely be the final formal review for years to come, the story settled into its penultimate shape, unresolved but illuminated, its contours defined enough to resist erasure. The silence that once concealed everything had been replaced by a different kind of quiet, one charged with awareness, one that acknowledged loss rather than obscuring it, and that quiet felt heavier, but also more honest. And as the case waited, preserved in files and memory, the understanding lingered that truth does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives slowly, unevenly, through persistence rather than revelation, and that even when it stops short of closure, it leaves an imprint that cannot be undone. In the end, there was no final scene that neatly tied the story together, no courtroom moment where everything snapped into place, no single sentence that could carry the weight of 35 years, and yet the conclusion arrived all the same, quietly, through accumulation rather than spectacle. The case rested where cold cases often do, suspended between proof and belief, between what could be shown and what could be understood, but unlike before, it was no longer invisible, no longer drifting at the edges of memory. It had a name, a timeline. A documented path that traced how a life intersected with another and then vanished. For investigators, that mattered, because it meant the work had not been wasted, that persistence itself had value, even when it fell short of conviction, and that future cases would benefit from what had been learned here, about listening longer, about preserving fragments, about trusting patterns that only emerge over time. For the family, the ending was not closure but recognition, the acknowledgement that what they had always believed was now part of the official record, no longer a private grief but a public truth, and that shift allowed mourning to settle into a different shape, one less burdened by doubt. The suspect remained free, his denials intact, his name linked permanently to a story he insisted was not his, and whether history would judge that connection as fair or flawed remained unanswered, but the association itself had altered his legacy in ways no verdict could fully control. The town carried the story forward, not as a cautionary myth but as a responsibility, a reminder of how easily silence can grow when questions go unasked, and how difficult it is to reverse that silence once it hardens into years. Files were archived with care, evidence stored, notes cross-referenced, because endings in cold cases are provisional by nature, always subject to revision by a future discovery, a technological advance, a confession that arrives too late or just in time. Time continued, as it always does, indifferent to resolution, but not to record, and in that indifference lay the quiet power of documentation, the assurance that what happened would not disappear again, even if answers remained incomplete. The story, now whole in its fragments, existed as a testament to persistence, to the belief that naming truth matters even when it cannot be proven beyond doubt, and that justice is not a single moment but a process that unfolds unevenly across decades. And so the case closed not with certainty, but with clarity, not with triumph, but with acknowledgement, leaving behind a legacy shaped as much by what was known as by what remained unresolved. Because sometimes, the final act of justice is not a verdict, but the refusal to forget, the decision to keep a name, a face, and a question alive, long after silence has lost its power. Long after the microphones were turned off, long after the last report was filed and the final update scrolled past unnoticed at the bottom of a screen, the case continued to exist in a place no document could reach, in the pauses between conversations, in the moments just before sleep, in the uneasy feeling that some stories refuse to stay finished. Because even without new evidence, even without a confession or a trial date circled in red, the truth had shifted the ground beneath everyone it touched, altering memories, reframing old moments, casting shadows backward through time. People began to replay ordinary scenes from decades earlier with new eyes, a conversation remembered too clearly, a gesture once dismissed, a decision that now felt heavier than it had any right to be, and these private re-examinations became the quiet aftershocks of the case, unseen but widespread. Investigators understood this phase well, the stage where a cold case stops being an active pursuit and becomes a living question, circulating through society in ways that no task force can direct, influencing how future witnesses come forward, how families speak, how silence is interpreted. The file itself remained technically open, its status unchanged, because cold cases rarely close cleanly, they simply enter longer intervals of waiting, held together by the possibility that one day, someone will say something they were not ready to say before. And sometimes, that someone is not motivated by guilt or conscience, but by age, by fear, by the realization that time has narrowed their options and that the truth, once withheld, may soon disappear with them. In Texas, the landscape carried on, highways expanding, neighborhoods replacing empty land, but the coordinates tied to the case stayed fixed, preserved in records even as the physical world transformed around them, a reminder that progress does not erase history, it merely builds over it. For the family, the years ahead promised no sudden relief, but there was a strange steadiness now, a sense that the worst uncertainty had already passed, replaced by something harder but more solid, the knowledge that the world finally knew what they had known all along. The suspect's name, once anonymous, now followed him silently, appearing in searches, in whispers, in the unspoken awareness of those who crossed his path, a consequence not imposed by a court, but by collective memory. And whether that was justice or something more ambiguous remained open to interpretation. Cold cases often end this way, not with resolution, but with recognition, not with answers, but with permanence, because once a story has been told fully enough, it resists being buried again. And somewhere in the space between proof and belief, between silence and speech, the case continued to breathe, sustained by the simple, stubborn act of remembering. Because as long as the question remains alive, as long as the name is spoken and the record exists, the story has not truly ended, it has merely learned how to wait. Years moved forward without ceremony, but the case moved with them, embedded in the routines of people who had learned to carry it quietly, like a weight redistributed rather than removed, felt most strongly when life slowed enough to notice. Journalists revisited the file occasionally, not because there was something new to report, but because the absence itself had become newsworthy, a reminder that justice does not operate on deadlines, and that some truths resist the pressure of time longer than others. Each anniversary arrived without fanfare, marked only by brief mentions, short articles, a few sentences that tried and failed to compress decades into a readable length, and then passed again, leaving behind the same unanswered question. Investigators aged out of the job, retiring with the case still unresolved, but not forgotten, passing along its lessons in quiet conversations, and cautionary advice to younger officers about patience, about documentation, about listening to what is not being said. Evidence remained preserved, catalogued against future possibility, because science moves forward even when people do not, and what is inconclusive today may become undeniable tomorrow, turning speculation into fact with a precision that once seemed impossible. The family watched these developments from a distance, no longer chasing updates but remaining open to them, having learned that hope in cold cases must be flexible, capable of existing without expectation. The suspect's life narrowed as well, circled by time and reputation, his name forever paired with an event he claimed did not define him, yet could not escape, because history does not require agreement to make an association endure. The town carried on, its population shifting, its landmarks changing, but the story stayed, resurfacing in classrooms, in late-night conversations, in the shared understanding that something unresolved had shaped the place in ways not immediately visible. Cold cases do this, they become part of the background noise of a community, not loud enough to dominate daily life, but persistent enough to influence how people think about safety, trust, and the cost of unanswered questions. And so the case continued, not actively unfolding, but not finished either, suspended in a state unique to stories that outlast their moment, held together by memory, by record, by the refusal to let silence reclaim what had already been spoken. Because even now, decades later, the story remains intact, waiting, patient, unfinished, proof that some truths do not disappear when the investigation slows, they simply endure, steady and unresolved, long after the headlines have faded. The shadow of the case stretched further than anyone expected, lengthening with each passing year, touching lives that had never appeared in the original reports, shaping perceptions in ways that were subtle but lasting. New detectives encountered the file early in their careers, not as an assignment but as a lesson, a thick reminder that not every investigation rewards urgency, that some demand endurance measured not in hours or days, but in decades. They studied the margins of the reports, the choices made under pressure, the moments where certainty was assumed too quickly or caution arrived too late, and those observations informed how future cases were handled, how questions were framed, how silence was treated not as absence, but as data. In the community, the story softened into something quieter, less explosive but more ingrained, no longer a shock but a presence, referenced without explanation, understood without retelling, part of the shared identity of a place shaped by what had never been resolved. Younger generations learned about it indirectly, through tone rather than detail, sensing that something had happened long before they arrived, something that still influenced the way adults spoke about trust, about strangers, about the limits of certainty. The family continued their lives with a careful balance, honoring memory without letting it dominate every moment, carrying grief that had evolved from raw pain into a steady ache, familiar, enduring, impossible to fully set down. Investigators remained alert for the unexpected, the late confession, the overlooked witness, the technological breakthrough that might finally align every fragment into a single, undeniable picture, knowing that cold cases sometimes end not with a breakthrough, but with a whisper. The suspect's name persisted in public consciousness, not loudly, not constantly, but reliably, resurfacing whenever the case was mentioned, inseparable from the narrative, a permanent footnote that refused to fade. Time did what it always does, compressing memory, blurring edges, but the core of the story remained intact, preserved by records, by repetition, by the collective decision not to let it slip entirely into obscurity. And in that persistence lay the final truth of the case, that even without resolution, it had altered lives, changed systems, reshaped a community's understanding of justice and patience. Because some cases never end in answers, they end in awareness, in vigilance, in the quiet understanding that silence is never neutral, and that the longest shadows are cast not by what is known, but by what remains unresolved. The waiting became the final condition of the case, not an active pause, but a permanent state, woven into everything that followed, shaping expectations, dulling urgency without erasing responsibility. There were moments when it seemed as though the story might finally move again, a rumor of new testing, a brief inquiry, a call returned after years of silence, and for an instant, the old tension resurfaced, only to settle back into stillness once more. This pattern repeated itself over time, anticipation rising and falling like a weak signal, never strong enough to carry resolution, but never disappearing entirely, and that persistence alone kept the case alive. Those who remembered the original events felt the weight of time most acutely, because memory sharpened even as answers remained distant, and the contrast between clarity and uncertainty became harder to reconcile with each passing year. Institutions adjusted, procedures evolved, laws changed, but the case remained anchored in 1988, bound to the decisions and limitations of its moment, a reminder that justice is often constrained by the era in which harm occurs. The land, the town, the people continued forward, yet the case stayed behind and moved with them at the same time, a paradox that defined its endurance, neither fully past nor fully present. For some, the story became a warning, a lesson carried into how they interacted with the world, more cautious, more attentive, less willing to assume that unanswered questions will eventually resolve themselves. For others, it became a quiet burden, an unresolved narrative that resisted closure, resurfacing unexpectedly, reminding them that some losses do not fade, they adapt. The suspect aged into obscurity, time eroding the immediacy of scrutiny without dissolving the association, his life narrowing into routine, shadowed by a name that could never fully detach from the case. And still, the file waited, evidence preserved, notes intact, the possibility of truth held open by nothing more than record and resolve, because as long as something remains documented, it remains possible. This was the final shape of the case, not solved, not forgotten, but sustained by attention, by memory, by the refusal to let silence reclaim what had already been named. Because in the world of cold cases, the ending is rarely an answer, it is the weight itself, stretching forward without promise, without relief, held together by the belief that even unanswered questions deserve to endure. Even after everything that could be said had been said, the case continued to echo, not loudly, not insistently, but with a persistence that refused to fade, like a sound trapped in a long corridor, growing softer yet never fully disappearing. The echo lived in paperwork pulled for reference, in late-night research sessions, in quiet moments when an investigator paused over a familiar name and wondered, briefly, if this might finally be the day something shifted. It lived in the family's routines too, surfacing without warning, triggered by an ordinary date on the calendar, a familiar road, a voice that sounded too much like someone remembered, proof that unresolved loss does not announce itself, it simply returns. Occasionally, new eyes examined the case, students, analysts, outsiders with no emotional history, only curiosity and distance, and their questions were different, less burdened, sometimes sharper, sometimes naive, but always circling the same center, the moment where everything broke apart. They noticed patterns others had missed, or at least rephrased them, and while none of it cracked the case open, the act itself mattered, because attention is a form of pressure, and pressure, over enough time, can change outcomes. Technology continued its quiet march forward, promising futures where today's uncertainty might look crude, and the evidence waited patiently for that future, sealed, labeled, untouched, as if aware that its relevance was not finished yet. The town spoke of the case less often now, but when it did, the tone had changed, no longer speculative, no longer dramatic, but solemn, respectful, as if everyone understood that the story had earned a certain gravity through endurance alone. The suspect's name still surfaced, less frequently, but reliably, appearing whenever the case was mentioned, a constant reference point in a narrative that had outlived outrage, suspicion, and most expectations. Time thinned the cast of those who remembered the beginning, witnesses passing away, memories hardening into fragments, and this gradual loss sharpened the urgency of preservation, because forgetting is not a single act, it is a process. And yet, even as people faded, the case did not, because it had moved beyond individuals, beyond personalities, becoming something larger, a record, a caution, a question that belonged to everyone now. This was the echo after time, the phase where a story no longer demands resolution to justify its existence, where meaning comes not from answers, but from the act of continued attention. Because as long as the echo remains, as long as the case is remembered, it resists erasure, and in that resistance lies its final, quiet power.